Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and welcome to my lecture on what does a systems analyst do. This is one of the introductory lectures for my systems analysis course. And many of the students who register for my course register because it's a required course. And they've got a fair idea of what a systems analyst does, but it's hazy. And they're going to find out when they get there. So you're here now, and it's time to start finding out. Now, there's no really one kind of pat, uh, um, easily encapsulated answer for the question. And what I really like to do is I like to describe the job and what it's like. And I'd like to compare it to a similar job in another profession altogether. Okay? Because I think there are a lot of corollaries. And not only does it, the metaphor is so the other profession is architectural design of homes. Okay, so what the systems analyst does for people in an organization who need some kind of information system solution is the same thing that the architect does for a family that wants a custom designed home. Okay? And so some people have already thought about what architects do, and some people haven't. But um, I like to use the metaphor because you can always get some mileage out of it when you're trying to figure out what your role is in a particular situation. You can kind of say, well, what would they do in that other profession? What would their role be? What would their obligations be? Because I think our roles are very similar. Now, uh, some people might say, okay, Kevin's pointing me at an architect, so a systems analyst is probably a systems architect. Well, that would be true if people used language consistently across professions, but in the design and construction of physical structures, an architect is typically a person who understands the needs of the potential users of the structures, does the design, so um, helps to identify the features, helps to pick a set of features that go with each other, um, and does the design up to a point on the technical side, and then they hand it over to people who do the rest of the design, okay, and who do the construction of the home. Um, in the systems world, the systems architects are pretty technical, okay? And that's a title that doesn't actually mean the same thing at every place that has that title. But generally speaking, systems architects are concerned with computing infrastructure and things that are pretty implementation specific, and they're not so concerned with the needs of individual users and solving business problems. Okay, so it turns out that system architect is probably not a good kind of a corollary name, and the systems analyst and um, traditional home design architects are a better corollary. So let's talk about what the architects do. We have a brochure here Architecturally Designed Homes in You. And this was created by the Minnesota chapter of the Society of the American Institute of Architects, which is their professional society, the main one in the United States. And they have state chapters, and this is the Minnesota one. And this is a kind of a brochure that people would give out to prospective customers, prospective clients, and it's sort of educating them on what it's like to work with an architect on an architecturally designed home. Okay? So I think it sort of explains the role pretty well. So we have an introduction page, and then they have this really nice kind of section here, 20 questions to ask before getting started. Okay, and so they're kind of asking us to think about, well, what are the things that we should think about before we actually go and talk to the architect? So for us as systems analysts, what do we hope that people have thought about before they come into our office or before they call us into theirs? Okay, and so what they have a bunch of questions that has the potential client getting in touch with what their needs are. So where do we live now? What do we like about it? What's missing? What don't we like? Do we want to change or add to the space that we have? Okay. Do we want to build a new house? Well, those are very much the kinds of questions that a systems analyst would ask a potential client in the systems area. But instead of talking about living space, we'd be talking about information systems. Why do we want to build a new house or add to or renovate our current home? Do we need more room? Is our lifestyle changing? Are children growing and moving? Are parents or children returning to live with us? It's the same thing, okay? If in fact we want to design a new system, well then probably things have changed in our needs, right? Now, you might say, well, maybe not, okay? Well, I think one of the really interesting things here, when you've got the potential clients thinking about these kinds of questions, is some might actually say, well, I'm not sure I want to build a new house, or I'm not sure I want to renovate our current home. And this is where the architect is probably going to say, I wonder if I have a real client here. Okay. What I might have is just somebody who has pretty common needs in terms of housing, and they could probably either go buy or rent something and not really have to go through the creative process of designing a custom home. Well, I'm going to say that this happens to systems analysts as well. You get people who come to you and they've got some kind of problem that relates to systems, but you pretty quickly realize that there's a ready-made solution for that, and it's not custom designed, right? And it's just sort of available to buy off the shelf. For instance, well, it looks like you need a copy of Microsoft Office, or it looks like you need a copy of Adobe Creative Suite for the cloud, right? So there will be times when you begin to engage with people and you start to ask them the kind of questions that they should be thinking about. And they're like, well, no, I'm not sure I'm that far along yet. In which case, you probably want to say, well, you still have some thinking to do. Why don't you go take a look at, see if you were the architect, you'd say, well, why don't you go take a look at the condos that are being sold over on the west side of town, and why don't you go take a look at the apartments that are for rent on the south side of town, and think about whether they meet your needs, okay? And then why don't we talk again? Because in looking at those things, you get a better idea of whether the ready-made solutions are just a good, quick fit to what you have, or whether you really need to work with someone like me on a more customized solution. Okay, so people who have easily solved problems in housing usually don't work with an architect. And people who have easily solved problems in information systems, they might work with the systems analyst, but not for long. Which we could have said, well, this is a job for email, this is a job for chat, this is a job for whatever, and we hook them up with the product, and they're on their way. Okay, so most of the skills of the systems analyst don't come fully to bear in that sort of short interaction. In the same way that most of the skills of the architect probably don't come, fully to bear in the interaction that they have with a potential client who really doesn't know if they want a custom home or not. But let's say we get over that hurdle for the home or the information system. And now these kinds of questions make a lot of sense. And here's some more. What is our lifestyle? Are we at home a great deal? Do we work at home? Do we entertain often? How much time do we spend in each of the living areas? Okay. Well, you could come up with the corollary questions for whatever the potential information system is. How much time and energy are we willing to invest to maintain our home? Okay. Well, this is the same kind of thing. In the same sense that the architect has to be sure that they have a real client here, while the systems analyst still has to realize that too. You might have a client who has a need, but doesn't really have the commitment or the resources to pursue the kind of stuff that you do with clients. Okay, and then that's the kind of stuff we're getting at with question 6. Let's see, 7. If we're thinking of adding on, what functions or activities will be housed in the new space? Okay, so for information systems, if we're thinking of enhancing an information system, what kinds of functions are we thinking of adding on? What kind of spaces do we need? Well, what kind of functions do we need to do our business process? How many of these spaces do we think we need? How many people are going to be using the information system solution? What do we think the addition, the renovation, the new home should look like? Okay. Here, the corollary for information systems probably has to do with things like, is it a web solution? Is it a dedicated desktop solution? Is it a mobile solution? Is it a responsive web application that can be accessed with, in a number of different ways? 11, how much disruption can we tolerate to add on or to renovate our home? Now, people think about this in terms of homes a lot, but they don't think about this quite often enough in terms of information systems. Typically, there's a way that we do things today, and that might be with an automated information system or not. In any case, if we decide we're going to do things with a different or new information system tomorrow. Well, there has to be some kind of conversion. And what's our taste for disruption? Can we be down for a week? Can we be down for a day? Can we be down for a weekend? Can we give up some of the functions for a short time? It's the same kind of question as question 11 would be for people who are thinking about housing. 12, how soon would we like to be settled in our new home or addition? Are the rigid time constraints? Okay. Well, people will always say, well, I'd like that tomorrow, right? Because we'd always like instant gratification. But in the home situation, perhaps somebody is coming to live with us. Perhaps we have maybe two aging parents, and one is about to go into some kind of nursing care because they can't be cared for in a home setting anymore. And when that happens, well, then we want the other parent to come to live in our home. Well, what's the timetable for parent one going into nursing care? And can we meet that? Well, we've got the same kind of thing here. We've got things that are happening in the business. And again, when I say business, I'm not only talking about for-profit enterprise. I mean, the business part of anything at all, including the academic world, the research world, the scientific world, the engineering world. They all have some kind of business that gets conducted. And what's happening that's going to drive the time frame? 13, if we're planning a new home, what do we envision in this home that we don't have now? Okay? And this is a really big deal because for instance, if you're planning a new home, it has an incremental cost. Okay, so you really have to be able to articulate what it's going to enable you to do or have that you don't have now, because you're going to have to ask yourself, is it worth that cost and time? Well, the same thing for systems. If we're contemplating building a home, do we have a site selected? Or maybe they've even bought a lot. Well, unfortunately, in the systems area, clients come to you in all kinds of circumstances, but they may be saying, well, we need a system solution that's compatible with this system and that system and some other system. Okay, well, that's a lot like having already bought a lot for the house. Okay, you're constrained. So let's go find out what the constraints are. 15, do we have strong ideas about design styles? What are our design preferences? Most of the design of information systems that users experience are in the user interface. So, so again, are people looking to have a smartphone app? Or are they looking to have a web app? What kind of thing are they thinking about? What qualities are we looking for in an architect? A specific style, extensive remodeling experience, a fresh outlook? Well, the interesting thing here is that you, as the budding systems analyst, you've got to think about what parts of your experience you have to qualify you to do this. Okay. Unfortunately, you only have the experience that you have. Okay, so you might not have extensive anything experience, but perhaps you have worked in, perhaps you know something about the industry that we're trying to solve the problem for. Well, I think the thing for the new architect, let's say the new architect, perhaps they hadn't work with any architect clients before, but maybe they had had a summer job on a construction crew, and maybe they built these kinds of homes before. Okay, or maybe they've lived in this kind of home, or they're a fan of this kind of home. So there's more than simply experience to be sold. And of course, people with lesser experience, by definition, have a fresh outlook. Okay, so this comes into play because you do need to get the confidence of people who are going to be your clients. 18, how much time do we have to be involved in the design and the construction process? There are times when people want to do a big project, but they don't want to invest any time in it. Well, a custom designed software solutions take time from the stakeholders to tell us about their needs and to look at our designs and give us feedback. So if they come back and say, well, we've got very little time to work with you, perhaps you've got to say, well, then what we ought to do is we ought to make sure that we contain how much we try to address so that we don't overburden your time. Maybe we do less. We reduce the scope of the project so that you have enough time to support our design effort. Do we plan to do any of the work ourselves? Not sure there's really a corollary here. I guess maybe the corollary would be something like this. If you're a systems analyst, you're either working for an organization who has an IT group and they can build things themselves, or they don't. And if they don't, well, then we're going to have to find somebody to build it. So I guess that addresses the kind of the make or buy question. Number 20, how much can we realistically afford to spend? Okay, you would like to think, it's pretty clear when you're dealing with a family that unless it's a truly wealthy family, that their resources are going to be limited, and you need to figure out what they are so that you're targeting them all the way along. Well, this is true for even for big business organizations. You have to have some idea about how long that they can take and how much they can afford to spend, because you don't want to get working on the design of a big solution and then we get it all designed and we say, well, it looks like this thing is going to cost $2 million to build. And they're like, $2 million? I've only got $20,000. So here we've got the same kind of questions being brought to the architect, and the same kinds of decisions having to be made as are made in the systems analyst situation. So the metaphor is pretty strong in this area. Okay, and the one we miss, who will be the primary contact? Okay, it's really important to have a primary contact, and the more modern approaches to systems design and project management, one of the methodologies that's pretty popular is this agile software development, agile project management. And the agile people look for a person to be the product owner. So they want a contact who can make kind of all decisions for the client. And it would be nice to know that you have that kind of thing in a person. So kind of interesting to ask the client, well, who would be the decision maker or makers, and what kind of time could they give to us? The next page has 20 questions that they could that the potential client could ask the architect that they were thinking of hiring. And I'm not going to really belabor these. I'm just going to say that I think that there are corollary questions that the information systems client might have for the systems analyst. Now, we're beginning systems analysts in this course, so we only have the experience that we have. And really, the best thing that we can do is to explain our experience in its best light. Okay? A lot of the questions that are going to come along are going to have to do with how do they work with us? What's that like? So let's go down and look at the next page, because what the architect guys have done that I really like is that they have a simplified workflow of how you work with the architect to design a custom single-family home, and what the roles are in each part. Okay, now there are corollaries in system, requirements, elicitation, and design and construction. And I'll talk you through it and think about how close things are. Okay, so step one, the architects call this programming or designing what to build. Okay, so this is where we elicit the requirements. Okay. We call this in the systems area, this is called requirements gathering. It's called requirements elicitation. Okay, this is where we spend a lot of time with the potential client, finding out about their business, we're finding out about their needs, and we're trying to figure out just how much we're going to tackle on this. Okay, so it's like the beginning step, but we call this requirements analysis, requirements elicitation, that kind of stuff. Okay, so we in the systems analysis course, we're going to spend a good amount of time learning about how to gather requirements and how to document them. Okay, and we're going to work with things like use cases, use case specifications, context diagrams, those kinds of things as a way of expressing what the needs are and how they translate into a system. So step two for the people in the building trade, schematic design rough sketches. And here's where they start to really sketch out things that look like parts of the structure. Okay, they draw diagrams. They draw pictures of things. They'll draw this thing they call an elevation, where you actually see a real rendering of what, say, the house would look like from the south side or something like that. This is like some of the early diagramming that we do when we work with our systems analysis clients. Okay. Then they moved into step three, design development, refining the design. This is where they get all the details exactly right. So they start out rough, sketching things rough, and then they review them and they get closer and closer to consensus about exactly what they want. Well, this evolving process is one that we're going to be taking with the different diagrams and specifications that we're going to be doing for the system. Okay, so that we don't have this idea that we do them one time and we're done. Okay, all the things that we're learning about, that all the techniques that we're going to learn, they all have the aspect of we interact with the client, we come to understand what we think the needs are, we go back and we express that in terms of diagrams or specifications, and then we review them with the client. And so we go from things that are kind of rough and broad in the beginning to things that are um, more exact and final in the end. And we do that through this sort of iterative process in working with the client. Step 4 here is preparation of the construction documents, and in the building trade, the architect, it tends to hand off the designs to engineers who actually do the technical drawings. So there's usually an electrical plan, and then there's a plumbing plan, and then there's an HVAC plan, and there's all these kinds of things. And these are typically done by specialists. Okay, and so um, um, in the systems area, I would say that the equivalent of this is when you begin to create, say, some kind of program specifications. Most of those things happen after systems analysis. So systems analysis is going to document the requirements and then the features, and we're going to sort of understand everything that the system has to do really well. We're going to do a preliminary design, and then when we have consensus on that, we're going to either we're going to buy something and we're going to compare whatever we want to buy to the requirements that we have already developed, or we're going to build something. In which case, if we're going to build, then we need to go on to a step like step 4 here, where people write detailed specifications for things. Okay, and that's really the first step of the construction process. That's the detailed design. Okay, and again, that's typically done by the construction team, and not by the systems analyst. The systems analyst sometimes is the supervisor of that. In the same sense, in step 4, when they prepared the detailed drawings, some of those the architect will do, but some of them will just go out to an engineering firm. Hiring the contractor, well, that's the make or buy. Typically, if you've been working in the building trade with an architect this long, you're not going to just go out and find something to buy. You're going to go out and hire a contractor, and they're going to build something to spec. Okay, now in the systems area, okay, once we get done with what I would call step 3, which is right about where we're going to end our project in our course, then you have a decision. Okay, you have to come up with proposals for either building the system or buying the system, and you might come up with alternative proposals at that point. And of course, if you can't build it in-house, you'll have to hire a contractor. And there is step 6, construction administration. Even though when you're building a house, you typically hand it over to a general contractor in step 5. A lot of times you continue to pay the architect to do supervision on the job. Okay, who's going to keep the general contractor honest as to whether or not they're building it to the exact specifications? Well, maybe not you, the user. You might not know enough. Okay, well, likewise, even though the role of the systems analyst per se, the formal role of the systems analyst kind of ends as we get to the equivalent of the end of step 3 and the beginning of step 4, the systems analyst is pretty frequently involved in the rest of the project as a supervisor or an advisor. So there's a real kind of a corollary there. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about just how close the metaphor is between the architect and the systems analyst. What I really like about it is that we, I think, generally from knowing about the architecture profession or from having friends who are in it or watching TV or movies, I think we have this idea that that architects are professionals. They have the interest of the client at heart. They have a professional relationship with the client. They have a set of they have a code of ethics. They have a code of conduct. Code of conduct. There are sort of expectations that they'll take care of the client and look out for their interests. They typically, as they work with, say, families, especially on the design and later the construction of single-family homes, they have to deal with people and people's potential failings, right? We have situations where people have a big appetite and a small budget. We have situations where there are maybe more than one faction in the family who don't want the same thing, and we need to find a way to come to consensus about how we're going to design the home. Well, all those kinds of what I call social work kind of aspects of the job for the architect in the housing setting, all those are true for the systems analyst in the IT setting. Okay, the stakeholders that we find for an IT project, they're not perfect. Okay, they don't always know what they need. They don't always know what they want. They need us to be consultative and directive, and they need us to facilitate a successful project. And so it's not a perfect analogy, it's not a perfect metaphor, but there's a lot to be gained by looking back to the architectural field and saying, this is kind of pretty much a corollary of what we're doing as a systems analyst. And it's a great way to think of ourselves in a consultative professional capacity. I'm not going to talk about the metaphor any more than that. We're going to be talking about what it's like to work as a systems analyst throughout the course. You'll have questions and I'll have answers, and some of you are probably already doing some of the work, and you'll have comments about what it's like for you, and we'll learn a lot together. So I've got you thinking about this. That's all I wanted to do. So I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye-bye.